had been a rough few weeks. The stress of work was starting to feel like a weight I couldn't shake off. My boss had been on my case. Deadlines were piling up, and the days seemed to blur into each other. So when my old friend, Tom, called up and offered me a weekend at his family's farm cabin to get away from the city, I didn't think twice. The cabin sat on the outskirts of a small town called Miller's Hollow, tucked away in the woods about an hour's drive from the nearest town. Tom had always spoken highly of it, the kind of place to find peace and solitude, far away from the noise of modern life, a chance to clear my head. He mentioned the cabin had been in his family for generations and had seen little use in recent years. I was ready for the break, so I packed my bags and made my way to the cabin. I drove up to Miller's Hollow late Friday afternoon. The roads were narrow and winding, surrounded by dense trees. As I turned off the main road onto the dirt path leading to the cabin, I couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation. The thick canopy above blocked most of the sunlight, and the only sounds were the crunching of gravel beneath my tires and the occasional chirp of birds hidden in the trees. The world felt far away from anything I knew. The cabin was exactly as Tom had described it. Old, weathered, and unassuming. It was made of rough-hewn logs, a simple one-story structure with a stone chimney that looked like it had been built a century ago. The front porch had a couple of rocking chairs that creaked when the wind blew. A small, overgrown garden sat next to the cabin, the edges of the garden now dominated by wild grasses and weeds. But it was still charming in its own way. Tom wasn't there when I arrived, but he had left the key hidden under a loose brick near the front door. I let myself in, and immediately, the smell of wood and old leather hit me. The interior was dim, lit only by the fading light of the evening sun through the dusty windows. It was a cozy, rustic space with a large stone fireplace, mismatched furniture, and old rugs scattered across the hardwood floors. There was a sense of age to the place, but it wasn't uninviting. It felt like the kind of place where time had slowed down and the world outside had no place. I settled in, unpacked my things, and explored the cabin. The kitchen was small but functional, with an old wood-burning stove, a worn countertop, and a rusted refrigerator. There was a narrow staircase at the back of the cabin that led up to a loft bedroom. I opened the door to the loft, which had a slanted roof with wooden beams that creaked as I stepped across the creaky floorboards. The bed was made up with faded quilts, and there was a small window that overlooked the forest behind the cabin. By the time I finished settling in, the sun had almost disappeared, leaving only a faint light behind the trees. I decided to start a fire in the fireplace to keep warm. As I did so, I noticed something strange about the atmosphere around the cabin. It was as if the air had grown heavier, more still. The forest outside seemed quieter too, like it was holding its breath. I shook it off as just my imagination, maybe the fatigue from the drive settling in. I made myself a quick dinner of canned chili, sitting at the kitchen table. As the fire crackled in the background, the unease in the air lingered, but I tried to push it aside. Tom wasn't due to arrive until later that night, so I decided to head outside for a walk to stretch my legs. The air had a sharp chill, and the forest seemed to close in around me as I ventured deeper, the trees stretching high above, their limbs twisting into strange shapes. The path, if you could even call it that, was more like a barely worn trail, overgrown with moss and fallen leaves. I walked for about half an hour, letting the quiet settle over me before I turned back. As I neared the cabin, I saw something moving in the trees near the edge of the woods, just a shadow in the dim light. I stopped, squinting, but it was gone as quickly as I had seen it. I tried to shake off the feeling creeping up my spine. It was probably an animal, something small like a deer or a raccoon. Still, there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I returned to the cabin, I started a second fire and settled in with a book. The night dragged on in silence, save for the occasional crackle from the fire and the distant calls of owls from the forest. Around 10 p.m., I heard the faint sound of an engine outside, followed by the crunch of gravel as Tom's truck pulled up the drive. Tom greeted me with his usual boisterous manner, his face flushed from the cold. He had brought some beer and other supplies, and we spent the next couple of hours chatting and catching up on old times. It felt nice, almost nostalgic, to be around a friend in such a peaceful place. But even as we relaxed, I noticed Tom seemed a little off. There was an odd look in his eyes, as if he was distracted, or maybe even nervous. I didn't think much of it until later that night, when we both went to bed. I was lying there in the loft, staring up at the beams of the ceiling, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that seemed to have settled back in. The wind outside picked up, making the trees rustle. I could hear the occasional creak of the house, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then, from below, I heard a door open. It was a soft creak, barely audible, but enough to make me sit up in bed. I listened for a moment, my pulse quickening. There was a long pause, followed by footsteps, slow, deliberate steps coming from the kitchen. I strained my ears, trying to figure out what was going on. I waited for Tom's voice, or maybe the sound of him moving about the cabin, but there was nothing. My heart started to pound in my chest. I couldn't explain why, but I knew something was wrong. I quietly crept down the stairs, moving as silently as I could. When I reached the bottom, I peered around the corner of the hallway. There was no one in sight. The kitchen was empty. Then, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The back door, the one that led out to the woods, was wide open. A gust of wind blew through it, rattling the door frame. I stood frozen for a long moment, my mind racing. Tom wasn't a prankster. He wouldn't have left the door open like that. And if he had gone outside, I would have heard him. Something wasn't right. My first instinct was to grab the phone and call for help, but I knew it was pointless. We were miles away from the nearest neighbor, and even cell service was spotty at best. I slowly crossed the kitchen, my senses on high alert, and moved toward the door. The cold air hit me in waves, the darkness outside pressing in. I looked around, hoping to spot Tom, but the woods were thick and black, only the occasional rustling of the wind disturbing the silence. Then I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, his back to me. His movements were slow, deliberate, and stiff. It was as though he was trying to avoid detection, but I knew it was him. I called out, but the words caught in my throat. Something wasn't right about the way he was standing, something off about his posture. I didn't wait to think. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward him, but as I got closer, I froze in my tracks. There was something else standing in the shadows with him. Another figure, tall and thin, with its back turned to me. The figure wasn't moving. It was standing unnaturally still, like it was waiting for something. I don't know how long I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, as if on cue, Tom suddenly turned around. His eyes were wide, his face pale and drawn. It was like he had seen a ghost. The air between us felt charged, like we were both trapped in some kind of unspoken understanding. Something had happened out here in the woods, something neither of us could explain. Tom didn't say a word. He just looked at me, his face contorted in fear. Then, he grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the cabin. We didn't stop until we were inside, the door shut tight behind us. Tom didn't explain anything that night. We stayed up for hours, neither of us sleeping, both too terrified to say much. By the time the sun came up, we both knew it was time to leave. Whatever had happened out there, we had to get out of that place. We packed our things and left, driving back to the city in silence. I never asked Tom about that night, and he never brought it up again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting. The cabin on Miller's farm remains untouched, abandoned, a place that neither of us ever went back to. As I look back now, I realize that the true horror wasn't what we saw, but the feeling that whatever it was, whatever had been in those woods, was still out there, and it always will be. I've always been the kind of person who enjoyed solitude, so when I was given the chance to spend some time in a remote cabin in the French countryside, I jumped at it. My name is Michael, and I'm 34 years old. I had just gone through a tough breakup and needed time away from everything. From people, from the city, from all the noise. The cabin was located deep in the woods, far from any neighbors, tucked away near a small village called St. Agnen. It was the perfect place to disconnect, recharge, and hopefully find some peace. The cabin itself wasn't much, just a simple 2-story building made of stone and timber, the kind of place that looked like it had been standing for centuries. It had an old-fashioned charm, with a slanted roof and wooden shutters that creaked whenever the wind blew. There was a small porch with a rocking chair on it, and a woodpile stacked neatly beside the front door. It didn't look like it had been lived in for a while, but it was well maintained, and the owner had left me with a set of instructions for everything I needed to know about the place. I arrived there on a Friday afternoon, the air cool and crisp with the faint scent of pine and damp earth. The drive had been long, several hours from Paris, and I was relieved to finally be at my destination. The silence was overwhelming, the kind of quiet that felt heavy and all-encompassing. It was a stark contrast to the usual hustle and bustle of city life. The sun was beginning to set as I unloaded my things from the car. I had a backpack with clothes, a couple of books, and a bottle of whiskey. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep me occupied for the weekend. The cabin felt like it was miles away from civilization, and as I stood there looking around at the dense trees and thick fog rolling in, I felt a strange sense of unease, but I shrugged it off. After all, I had come here to escape, and I wasn't about to let a few nerves ruin that. Inside the cabin, it was even more rustic than I had expected. The floors were made of dark oak, worn smooth from years of use. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper and shelves filled with old books and trinkets. There was a large fireplace in the living room, with a pile of logs stacked beside it. A comfortable-looking sofa sat near the window, where I could see the mist creeping along the ground outside. The kitchen was small but functional, with an old stove and a tiny table in the corner. The upstairs had 2 bedrooms, one of which I would use, and a bathroom tucked away in the back. After getting settled, I spent the evening reading by the fire, sipping whiskey, and watching the rain begin to pour down outside. The storm had been building for hours, and now it was in full swing, with thunder rumbling in the distance and lightning flashing across the sky. The wind picked up, causing the trees to sway violently, and the cabin creaked as if it were protesting the storm's fury. I didn't mind the storm. In fact, I found it soothing. It was the perfect backdrop for a weekend of isolation. But as the hours wore on, the feeling of unease started to grow. I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The rain was loud, but there was something about the way the wind howled outside that felt wrong. I tried to ignore it, turning up the volume on the record player to drown out the sound of the storm, but it didn't help. At some point, I must have fallen asleep on the couch, the fire dying down to embers. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a loud thud from upstairs. My heart raced, and I immediately sat up, straining to listen. There it was again, a heavy, distinct noise, like something falling or being knocked over. I stood up slowly, trying to shake off the fog of sleep, my breath coming in shallow bursts. My mind raced, trying to think of an explanation. Maybe the old house was just settling, I told myself. Maybe it was just the wind. But as I stood there in the darkness, staring up at the wooden staircase leading to the second floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag, its weak beam barely cutting through the thick shadows of the room. I crept toward the stairs, the creaking of the wooden floorboards under my feet sounding deafening in the silence. The noise had stopped, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. I reached the top of the stairs and shined the flashlight down the hallway. The light flickered as if struggling against the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with every movement. There was nothing out of the ordinary. No broken furniture, no signs of forced entry. Just an old wooden floor and closed doors to the 2 bedrooms. I told myself I was being paranoid, and yet, something in the back of my mind told me to be cautious. I checked the doors one by one, but found nothing. Everything was as it should be. I was just about to head back downstairs when I heard a faint noise coming from one of the rooms. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The soft rustle of something moving. My heart skipped a beat. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed open the door to the room nearest me. The flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing an empty bed and a small desk. The window was open slightly, letting in the cool night air. But as my light moved toward the far corner of the room, I froze. There, in the corner, was a shape, a figure. It was hunched over, almost as if it were crouching or hiding. I couldn't make out any details, but the outline of the figure was clear enough. My first instinct was to bolt, but my body felt frozen in place. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Then, just as suddenly as I had seen it, the figure moved. It was fast, too fast, and in an instant it was gone, slipping into the darkness beyond the beam of my flashlight. I don't know how I managed to react, but I slammed the door shut and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there, my breath ragged, my mind spinning. I had to be imagining things. There was no one in the cabin but me. I had locked all the doors when I arrived. I had checked every room. And yet, I couldn't deny what I had seen. I didn't know what to do. I thought about leaving, about driving back into town, but I wasn't sure I could make it through the storm. I thought about calling for help, but who would I even call out here? There was no signal, no way to contact anyone. So I did what I could to calm myself down. I went back downstairs, locked every door, and made sure the windows were all shut tightly. I sat by the fire for a long time, waiting for the storm to pass, listening for any more strange sounds. The hours dragged on, but nothing else happened that night. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of dread hanging over me. The storm had passed, and the sky was clear, but the air felt thick and heavy. I decided to leave the cabin. I packed up my things, checked every room one last time, and locked up before getting in my car. The drive back to town was long and uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me from that cabin. I never went back to that cabin again. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, maybe it was the isolation getting to me, but whatever it was, I knew that the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edges of the light, was something I couldn't escape. The cabin still stands, I'm sure, in the middle of those dark woods, waiting for someone else to come and find it. Building a small cabin in the middle of nowhere on a rainy night is something I'll never forget. The job wasn't what I expected, but in a way, that made it even more memorable. I had taken a job to construct a simple, off-the-grid cabin for a wealthy client who wanted some peace and quiet. The location was deep in the woods in the middle of nowhere, a few hours from the nearest town. I'm not exactly a carpenter by trade, but I knew enough to get by, and I could handle a little work with wood. It was the middle of October, and the weather had already turned colder than I was used to, even though the weather report said it'd be a mild fall. But no, it wasn't mild at all. I had been working at the site for a week, and the first few days had been clear and crisp, but things were about to change. The client, James Carter, was an older man in his late 50s, with a gruff exterior and a tendency to speak in short, clipped sentences. He didn't give me much direction, which I appreciated in a way. He just wanted a small cabin, something simple that he could escape to. By the third day, the skies began to darken earlier than expected. A storm was brewing, and soon enough, the heavy rain started to pour down, turning the already muddy ground into thick, sticky mud. I was halfway through putting up the cabin's frame when the downpour started. I had hoped it would blow over quickly, but the rain only intensified as the evening wore on. I had a little tent set up a short distance from the construction site. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small tent I used to sleep in at night, but it did the job. I was hoping to finish a few more tasks before calling it a night, but with the rain pounding down, I realized it was going to be a long one. By then, the frame was mostly set, but I still had a ways to go before the structure would be anywhere near livable. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the rain wasn't showing signs of stopping. The forest was dense, and the trees swayed in the wind, making the darkened sky seem even more oppressive. The whole area felt isolated, like the kind of place where time slows down, and it's easy to lose track of everything else. As I worked, I couldn't help but notice how eerily quiet the forest was. Usually, there's the sound of insects or birds, but that night, it felt like the entire forest had gone still. I decided to call it a night around 9 p.m. when I could barely see through the sheets of rain anymore. I had just finished securing the roof beams and started heading toward the tent when I heard a noise behind me. Something that wasn't the rain or wind. It was a sound that didn't quite fit, like a branch snapping, but not in the way branches usually snap. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned around, but the rain was so thick I could barely make out anything through it. For a few seconds, I stood still, listening. I had a strong sense of unease creeping up my spine. The whole area was isolated, and the only people around were me and James, so I couldn't understand what or who would be out there in the storm. I figured it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, but the way the sound lingered made me question that. I started walking back to the tent, shaking off the feeling. I tried to keep my mind occupied, telling myself that it was just the forest being its usual self. After all, I had been working in remote places before and hadn't had any issues. But tonight felt different. The rain had a constant pounding rhythm, and the wind was picking up, pushing the trees back and forth. There was something about the way the storm made everything seem more distant, like the entire world was swallowed up by the wet, dark night. I reached my tent and unzipped the door, crawling inside and quickly securing the flap. The tent was small, just enough to fit a cot and a bag, but it was warm enough once I had the small heater running. I pulled my wet clothes off, hung them by the tent entrance to dry, and climbed into my sleeping bag, hoping I could get some rest despite the storm. I tried to settle in, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. It wasn't just the sound, it was the silence that came after. Everything had gone still. The storm's steady thrum was the only thing I could hear now. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, staring at the walls of the tent, my mind racing. At one point, I heard the sound again, but this time, it was closer, the snap of a branch. I knew for a fact that the forest around me wasn't home to many large animals. The usual wildlife around here was smaller stuff, rabbits, raccoons, maybe a fox or two. I didn't expect to hear something like this. The noise was sharp, and I could tell it was on the move. I slowly reached for the flashlight I had stashed at the corner of the tent, flicked it on, and shone it toward the entrance. The light barely penetrated the sheets of rain outside, but I still couldn't see anything. I waited. The wind howled, but no more sounds came from the forest. My heart rate sped up. I wasn't sure what I was afraid of, but I knew that something wasn't right. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, the minutes dragging on. The storm continued to rage, and I tried to push the unsettling feeling away. But then, there was another noise. This time it was closer to the tent. The sound of footsteps, the wet squelch of shoes in the mud. I felt my stomach drop. I wasn't sure how long it had been since the last noise, but the rain was falling harder now, and I couldn't see past the small space of the tent. The footsteps seemed to circle around, slow, almost deliberate. I grabbed my jacket and yanked it on, then zipped open the flap and stepped outside. The rain hit me like a wall, and the cold was immediate, seeping into my skin. I scanned the area, shining the flashlight into the dark, but I saw nothing, just trees, wet ground, and the constant rain. The world felt smaller in the rain, the trees standing tall and looming, casting long shadows despite the storm. I told myself it was nothing. There was no one out here, no one but me. Maybe it was just my imagination getting the best of me. I was alone in the woods, deep in isolation. Could have been the wind, or maybe an animal, something in the underbrush. My breath came in sharp bursts, and I took a few deep ones to calm myself down. But as I started to turn back to the tent, I heard it again. Closer this time, the wet slapping of shoes in the mud, and then the unmistakable sound of someone or something breathing heavily, close enough that I could almost feel it. I turned sharply and swung the flashlight back into the forest, praying to see nothing. But this time I caught a glimpse. In the shadows, just beyond the range of the light, a figure stood still. Not an animal, not a shadow, person, tall, lanky, and drenched from head to toe in rain. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring into the woods as if it hadn't noticed me. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't tell if they were looking at me or if they were simply too far to notice. The world felt muffled, my breath quickening as I took a step backward. And then the figure moved. It didn't rush or startle. It simply turned, walking back into the trees, disappearing into the rain-soaked darkness. I stood there for a long moment, frozen to the spot. I don't know why I didn't run or scream, but my feet wouldn't move. The footsteps faded into the storm. The world returned to that deep, oppressive silence. I retreated back to the tent, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I zipped it up and sat against the wall, trying to gather my thoughts. The storm raged on, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread that wouldn't let go. The figure was gone, but I knew what I had seen. I wasn't imagining it. The next morning, I packed up and left. The rain had let up, but the sky was still heavy, as if the storm had left a permanent mark on the world. I didn't finish the cabin. I didn't care anymore. The uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. As I drove back toward civilization, I couldn't shake the thought that someone had been watching me in the night, watching and waiting. When I arrived home, I told myself I would never return to that place. It wasn't the isolation or the storm. It wasn't even the rain. It was the feeling of being watched, of knowing that there was someone or something out there lurking in the shadows. I never finished the cabin, and I don't think I ever will. It was the kind of place that should remain unfinished, just like the story. The first time I set foot in the cabin, I knew it was going to be different from all the others. I'd spent plenty of nights in small, remote cabins in the middle of nowhere, places far from the distractions of everyday life. But this one had a certain heaviness to it, a kind of weight that pressed down on you, almost like the place itself was trying to tell you something. I was 35, an experienced hunter, someone who'd spent more nights in the wild than I could count. My name is Jack, and I had been invited by an old friend of mine, Eric, to join him for a week-long hunting trip. Eric and I had grown up together, and though we drifted apart in recent years, I couldn't resist when he called me up out of the blue, asking if I wanted to spend some time in a cabin his uncle owned up in the mountains. It was early autumn, and the mountains were starting to get that crisp feel in the air. The leaves were just beginning to change color, and the forest smelled of pine and wet earth. Eric told me that the cabin was isolated, a good 2-hour drive off the main road, and that it would be perfect for a relaxing getaway. I wasn't sure why, but something about the idea of the place felt off. Maybe it was the fact that Eric hadn't really been back to visit in years. I'd never heard of his uncle having a cabin before, and I found it strange that he'd never mentioned it when we were younger. But I pushed that feeling aside. I told myself I was just being paranoid, and that nothing could go wrong on a hunting trip. When I arrived, the cabin was everything I'd imagined. A small, worn-down building that looked like it had been built decades ago. The wood was old, the walls sagging a little under the weight of years and weather. There was no electricity, only a small gas stove and a fireplace that had clearly been used in the past. The roof looked sturdy enough, but the windows were covered with grime and dust. The place had a neglected, forgotten feel about it, like it had been left behind by time. Eric was already there, unloading his gear from the truck. He looked the same as always, tall, rugged, with a stubble that seemed permanent. When he saw me, he waved and grinned. "Glad you could make it," he said. "I told you, this place is perfect for getting away from everything. No distractions, no one around for miles." The first night was uneventful. We ate a simple dinner of canned beans and sausages, washed it down with some beer, and talked about old times. The night was quiet, almost too quiet. The wind rustled through the trees outside, but there was no sound of animals or the usual night creatures. No owls hooting, no rustling of small mammals scurrying through the underbrush. It felt strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time. We were here to hunt, not to sit and listen to the woods. The next morning, Eric and I went out early, just as the sun was rising, with our rifles slung over our shoulders. The forest around the cabin was dense, with thick stands of trees and underbrush. It was exactly the kind of place where you'd expect to find deer, maybe even a bear if you were lucky. The ground was soft from the recent rains, and the scent of wet leaves hung in the air. As we walked deeper into the forest, I started to notice things that didn't sit right. The tracks were fresh, but there was something off about them. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but they didn't look like the usual deer tracks I was used to. They were too large, too heavy, like something with a much bigger frame had been moving through the woods. I pointed it out to Eric, but he just brushed it off. "Probably just a moose," he said. "They come through here sometimes. Nothing to worry about." But I wasn't so sure. The tracks didn't match anything I had seen before. They were oddly spaced, and there was something unnatural about the way they twisted around the trees, almost as if whatever had made them was trying to avoid being noticed. But I didn't want to scare Eric, so I kept my thoughts to myself. We spent the whole day out there, but we didn't see anything. No deer, no bears, not even the usual squirrels and rabbits. Just silence, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, we headed back to the cabin, empty-handed. That night, things started to feel off. Eric had gone to bed early, exhausted from the hike, but I stayed up, sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. The cabin creaked as the wind picked up, rattling the windows and shaking the wooden beams above me. I kept hearing noises outside, but every time I looked, nothing was there. Around midnight, I heard something moving around outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or an animal, but the sound was too deliberate. There was a rhythm to it, something human about it. I stood up, my heart racing. I grabbed my rifle and cautiously walked over to the door, but when I peered through the small window, all I saw was darkness. It was cold outside, and the wind had started to howl again. I stood there for a long time, straining my ears, but the sound was gone. Reluctantly, I returned to the fire, still feeling uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The next day, I decided to go out again, But this time, I went alone. Eric was still sleeping when I left, and I needed to clear my head. The woods were quiet as I made my way through them, the only sound my boots crunching on the frozen ground. I was following the strange tracks again, hoping to figure out what kind of animal had made them. I kept my rifle ready just in case. That's when I saw it. I had reached a small clearing when I noticed something strange up ahead. It was a shape, hunched over, almost like a person, but it was covered in a dark, matted fur. The thing was rummaging through the underbrush, its movements jerky and erratic. I froze, my heart in my throat. At first, I thought it was a bear, but it was too strange. Bears don't move like that. It was too unnatural. I felt a wave of fear rush over me, but I couldn't look away. I slowly raised my rifle, lining it up with the creature's back. But just as I was about to pull the trigger, it turned. It wasn't a bear. It was something else, tall, hunched, with long arms that reached down to the ground. Its face was covered in fur, but I could see its eyes, wide and shining in the dim light. It was staring directly at me. For a moment, everything stopped. I didn't breathe, didn't move, just locked eyes with this thing, whatever it was. It was almost like it knew I was there, like it was waiting for me to make the first move. Then, in a split second, it turned and bolted off into the trees, disappearing into the woods before I could react. I stood there, stunned, for what felt like an eternity. My hands were shaking so much that I had trouble lowering my rifle. I didn't know what to think. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen before. I had hunted in these woods for years, but this was something else. I hurried back to the cabin, my mind racing. I didn't tell Eric what I had seen. He wouldn't have believed me anyway. And even if he did, I knew I wouldn't be able to explain it. All I could do was pack up my things and get out of there. The next morning, I left without saying a word to Eric. I don't know what I saw in those woods that day, but I know I'll never go back to that cabin. Something was out there, something that didn't belong, and I wasn't about to find out what it was. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one leaving. It had been a long drive from the city, the kind of drive that drags on until the road stretches out like an endless ribbon, twisting between trees and empty fields. The cabin sat nestled in the woods, a few miles away from the nearest town, and I'd been looking forward to the solitude. It was just me, the trees, and the wild air, far from the noise of the city, from work, from everything. I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, I thrived in it. The year was 2023. I was 32 years old, living in the rush of urban life. A bit of a loner, really. I had booked this cabin for a week of quiet, to reset, clear my head, and maybe get some writing done. My name's Jason, by the way. I'm not much for talking, but I'm pretty comfortable in my own skin. I'd gotten used to being alone. It didn't bother me. I wasn't one of those people who needed constant company. In fact, I preferred the company of my thoughts to the buzz of social interaction. When I arrived, the sun had begun to dip behind the trees, casting a soft orange glow over the cabin. It was small, but it was perfect for what I needed. A stone fireplace, a small kitchen with a gas stove, and one large window that overlooked a vast, untouched stretch of forest. The view was beautiful in a way that felt almost haunting. I settled in, unpacked, and made myself some coffee. The cabin was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt empty. It was full of life, full of soundless rustling from the woods and the occasional bird call. The kind of quiet that lets you hear your own heartbeat, the air in your lungs, and the distant creaks of an old building settling in. It felt like I'd been there for hours, just sitting on the couch, staring out the window, when I noticed the first strange thing. At the edge of the forest, where the trees started to thicken, there was a movement, a figure. At first, I thought it was a deer, but the way it moved was off. It wasn't the fluid, graceful way of a deer. No, this figure moved too slowly, too deliberately. I squinted through the window, trying to make it out more clearly, but the light was fading, and all I could see was a dark, hulking shape. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my eyes playing tricks in the low light. Maybe it was just the wind moving something. Still, the figure lingered in my mind, and I found myself distracted, wondering who would be out there, this far from town. There was no one else around for miles. The nearest neighbor was about a mile away, and they were an old couple who rarely left their home. So what was that? I didn't know. As night fell, I made a simple dinner and ate in front of the fire, the cabin feeling cozier with the flames crackling in the hearth. I tried to ignore the odd feeling creeping up on me. The figure wasn't there anymore, but my mind kept going back to it. Maybe it was just some wildlife I hadn't seen before. Bears were rare, but they lived in the area. Still, this didn't feel like a bear. The way it moved didn't fit. I finished my meal, washed the dishes, and went to bed early. The bed was comfortable enough, and I fell asleep quickly. But sleep, as it often does in places like this, was restless. The night outside seemed unnaturally still. The wind had died down, and the only sounds I could hear were my own breathing and the faint, irregular noises from the forest. It was too quiet. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. There was no reason for it. I just opened my eyes, wide awake, my mind sharp. At first, I didn't think anything of it. But then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound. It was so subtle at first that I couldn't place it, but it was there, a tapping noise. Tap, tap, tap. Came from outside the cabin, just beneath the window. My heart rate kicked up a notch. I listened, straining to hear it again, but all I heard was the rustling of the wind in the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I got out of bed, tiptoed to the window, and slowly peered outside. Nothing. The moon was barely visible through the canopy of trees, casting everything in a soft, ghostly light. The ground was covered with fallen leaves and pine needles, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. I felt foolish for getting up over a noise I probably imagined. I turned back to the bed, but the unease wouldn't leave me. The tapping sound continued, louder this time, like a steady, rhythmic knocking on wood. I didn't know what to make of it. I had no neighbors, no other cabins nearby, nothing that could explain the noise. Was it an animal? Maybe a bird pecking at the window? But that didn't feel right either. I stood there for a moment, listening intently, before deciding I was being paranoid. After all, the cabin was sturdy, and the woods were known for their odd noises. I didn't need to let my imagination run wild, but sleep didn't come easily after that. Every little creak of the building made my skin crawl. Every wind-blown leaf that brushed against the window made me jump. I kept hearing the tapping noise, and it seemed to come from different places around the cabin now. It was subtle, but it was there. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. By morning, the tapping had stopped. The sun rose through the trees, and the world outside seemed calm again. I tried to convince myself it had all been some kind of half-awake nightmare. But the feeling of being watched lingered, a gnawing sensation in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. I went outside to stretch my legs, hoping to clear my head. The woods around the cabin were beautiful, with towering trees and the occasional burst of wildflowers. The fresh morning air filled my lungs, and for a moment, I felt at peace. The noise from last night seemed like a distant memory. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of the woods, where the trees grew dense and dark, there was a large footprint in the dirt. It wasn't animal, not any animal I knew of, at least. The print was too large, the toes too human. The ground was soft, still damp from the night's chill, and the imprint was clear. I crouched down to examine it, my mind racing. The size of the print was unnerving, and there was something about it that didn't sit right. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. I didn't know what to make of it. The first thought that came to mind was that someone had been out here, someone who didn't belong. But who would be out here? The nearest road was miles away, and the trail to the cabin was barely a dirt path. No one would be out here. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself. I hiked through the woods, telling myself the footprint was just some oddity of nature, maybe a large bear or something else that had wandered in. But the longer I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. The thought of someone being out there, in the woods watching my cabin, began to creep into my mind. Couldn't shake it. That night, I locked every door and window, pulling the curtains tight. I didn't want to feel trapped, but I did. I stayed up late again, listening for any sound that would tell me if I was just being paranoid, or if someone really was out there. I never heard the tapping again, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was out there, in the dark, waiting. The next morning, I packed up and left the cabin, despite my original plan to stay for the week. I couldn't explain it, but the woods had gone from peaceful to terrifying in the span of just a few days. I didn't feel safe anymore. As I drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror at the cabin slowly disappearing from view, I felt a strange relief. The woods had been too quiet, too still, and whatever that figure was, whatever those footsteps meant, I didn't want to find out. I never went back to that cabin. It was a quiet evening when I arrived at the cabin, tucked away in the dense woods of northern Idaho. The kind of place that seemed frozen in time, isolated from everything else. I was there to get away from the noise of city life, a break from my busy schedule, my demanding job, and the constant buzz of social media. The cabin, an old structure with a rusted metal roof, stood alone amidst towering trees that stretched far into the horizon. I'd found the place online, a rustic retreat with just enough comfort to make it feel like home, but still primitive enough to give me the solitude I needed. The air was cool, a slight breeze rustling the leaves overhead. The smell of pine and damp earth filled my lungs as I unloaded my bags from the back of the truck. The sun had already dipped behind the mountains, leaving behind a soft twilight. My phone had no signal out here, which was exactly what I wanted.
No interruptions.
No one to bother me. I stepped inside the cabin, the door creaking as I pushed it open. The space inside was small but cozy. A stone fireplace dominated one side of the room, with a few chairs and a wooden dining table scattered around. A single lamp flickered on the far end, casting a warm, yellowish glow over everything. There was a faint smell of wood smoke lingering in the air, probably from the last time the place was used. It wasn't luxurious by any means. The floors creaked underfoot, and the furniture was basic, but it had a certain charm to it. I threw my bags on the bed in the small bedroom at the back of the cabin, the only one in the house. The windows looked out over the forest, but tonight they were covered with heavy curtains, the moonlight struggling to break through. I turned on the lamp beside the bed, unpacked my things, and decided to take a walk before the night fully set in. The quiet felt unnatural, too still, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. I grabbed my jacket and stepped back outside, closing the door quietly behind me. The cool air nipped at my face as I wandered deeper into the woods. The trees stood tall and imposing, their branches twisting and turning as if reaching out to catch me. The path, a narrow dirt trail, wound its way around the forest, and I followed it with no particular destination in mind. The only sound was the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustling of wildlife in the underbrush. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was subtle at first, just a sense of being watched, a fleeting thought that passed through my mind and quickly disappeared. But the longer I stayed out there, the stronger the feeling grew. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow darting between the trees. I stopped, frozen for a moment, listening, but heard nothing. No wind, no animals, no voices, just the deep, unsettling silence of the forest. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks, the result of being in an unfamiliar place. But even as I turned to head back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. I quickened my pace, my boots thudding against the ground louder now, as if I needed to get back to the safety of the cabin. When I finally reached the door, I hesitated for a moment, standing just outside, looking back at the dark woods behind me. The trees loomed, casting long shadows in the fading light. Something was off, but I couldn't place it. The feeling of being watched was still there, and now it felt more pressing, more real. My skin prickled with the cold, or maybe it was something else. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, locking it behind me. The creak of the door seemed louder than it should have been, and I felt a sudden urge to check the windows. I walked over to the nearest one, pulling back the curtain slightly to peer outside. The darkness beyond was thick, impenetrable. Nothing moved. Nothing was there. I sat down at the wooden table, trying to shake off the unease that was growing in my mind. My fingers drummed nervously against the surface. I told myself it was just a long day, that I needed to relax, but the feeling didn't leave. It lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. I reached for the small radio on the counter, hoping to fill the silence with some noise. The static buzzed as I turned the dial, eventually landing on a station playing soft classical music. It was calming at first, but soon enough, the stillness of the cabin began to feel oppressive again. That's when I heard it, a faint scratching sound, barely audible over the music, came from outside. I jumped, my heart racing in my chest. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the sound continued, slow and deliberate, like something or someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy as I walked to the door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. I opened the door cautiously, peering into the darkened woods, half expecting to see nothing but the trees and the quiet night. But then I saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the reach of the cabin's porch light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, my eyes playing games with me. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, watching. I couldn't make out details, just the shape of a person, tall and thin, standing in the dark. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Who the hell was that? And why were they just standing there? I backed away from the door, my pulse quickening. The figure didn't move. It didn't step forward or retreat. It just stayed there, locked in place. I slammed the door shut, the sound echoing in the silence. My heart was pounding now, my mind racing to find an explanation. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears as I backed away from the door, my eyes glued to it, waiting for the slightest sign that the figure would move. But nothing happened. The minutes dragged on in agonizing silence. I grabbed my phone, even though I knew there was no signal. The damn thing was useless out here, but it felt comforting to hold it. I tried calling the cabin's owner, the number I had gotten from the website, but as expected, there was no connection. The call wouldn't go through. I didn't know what to do. The figure outside was still there. It had to be. I didn't dare open the door again to check. The hours felt like days. I spent the rest of the night staring out the window, unable to tear my eyes away from the darkness outside. My mind ran through every possible scenario. Was someone just playing a prank on me? Was it a lost hiker? Or maybe someone who had wandered too far into the woods? But nothing made sense. No one had come by since I arrived, and this was a remote area. The nearest town was miles away. The morning came slowly. I hadn't slept a wink. The sky outside had just started to lighten, the first signs of dawn breaking over the horizon. The forest was still silent, the usual sounds of wildlife missing. I stood by the window, waiting, hoping to see some sign of movement. Then, as the light grew stronger, I finally saw it. The figure was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief, but it was a hollow one. I couldn't explain what had happened or who that person was, but the fact that they were gone didn't erase the unease that still lingered in my chest. I packed up quickly, grabbed my things, and made my way back to the truck. I didn't want to stick around to find out more. The cabin, once charming and secluded, now felt like a prison. As I drove away, the road stretching out before me, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin, now distant in the background, seemed as if it had never been anything more than a fleeting thought. I felt the weight of the unease lifting slowly as I left the woods behind. But there was one thing I knew for sure. I would never come back to that cabin again. The figure in the woods, whoever or whatever they were, would remain a mystery, one I would never solve. But I didn't need to. Some things are better left unexplained, I realized. Some things should stay in the dark. And as the truck rumbled down the winding road, I knew one thing for sure. The woods had their secrets, and some of them were better left buried. The first time I saw him, I was trying to fix the door. It had been an old cabin, tucked away in the woods, about 5 miles off the nearest gravel road. The kind of place that looked like it was pulled straight out of the past, with its creaky wooden floors and old beams that had been painted 100 times but still looked aged. I'd been coming out here for a week every fall for the past few years. It was just me, the cabin, and the forest, a place where I could escape my stressful job and recharge. I had just turned 33, which meant I was in the middle of a crisis I couldn't quite define. My mind had been running in circles for months. The cabin had become a refuge, a way to disconnect from the relentless pace of my life in the city. It wasn't much, just a one-room cabin with a rusty stove, a few rickety pieces of furniture, and a bed that creaked louder than it should whenever I moved. But it was mine, or at least it felt that way. The day I saw the man with the short glasses started like any other. The morning was cool, the sun barely breaking through the thick canopy of trees, casting long shadows on the ground. I stepped outside to stretch, taking in the crisp air, the scent of pine and earth. I was alone, just the way I liked it. I'd been struggling with the door for hours. The old hinges had worn out over time, and the door wouldn't stay shut without a chair propped up against it. That morning, I decided to do something about it. I grabbed my toolbox and set to work. My hands were cold from the autumn air, but the work felt good, like something tangible I could hold onto. As I knelt in front of the door, adjusting the latch, I heard a rustling in the woods beyond the cabin. It wasn't the sound of animals, it was too deliberate, too human. I paused, my hands stilling as I tried to listen. The wind picked up, making it hard to hear anything clearly, but I thought I heard footsteps. Not the crunching of leaves or twigs from some forest creature, but the steady, deliberate thud of boots on the ground. I stood up slowly, dusting off my hands. The door, halfway fixed, was still swinging slightly open. I glanced around the cabin, looking for anything that might explain the noise. That's when I saw him. He was standing in the clearing about 50 yards away, just watching me. A man, tall but not imposing, wearing a dark jacket and pants that looked like they had seen better days. His most noticeable feature was the pair of short, thick glasses he wore. They seemed too small for his face, perched low on his nose. He stood there for a moment, his gaze fixed on me, not moving an inch. I didn't know what to do. It wasn't unusual to see people around this area, especially since I'd been coming up here for years. But this felt different, felt wrong. The man didn't wave or try to call out to me. He didn't do anything. He just stood there. I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling settling in my chest. I called out, though I didn't expect much of a response. "Hey, you lost or something?" Nothing. For a second, I thought maybe he hadn't heard me. But then I noticed something. His posture. He wasn't just standing there. He was waiting for what I had no idea. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I tried to ignore it. I was in the middle of nowhere, after all. I had a cabin to fix. I didn't need to get caught up in strange encounters with people. I turned back to the door, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching. My mind raced, thinking of all the possible explanations. Someone passing through the woods, maybe. But I couldn't shake the unsettling sensation that this wasn't just some random traveler. I grabbed the hammer, focusing on the task again, hammering nails into the frame to secure the door. My hands were shaking now. My movements were jerky, less fluid than usual. The weight of the silence pressed on me, and every sound, the wind, the creaking of the cabin, felt amplified, like the world was holding its breath. Suddenly, I heard something that made me stop. A slow, deliberate step, then another, and another. The man was moving closer. My heart hammered in my chest as I glanced over my shoulder. He was walking toward me now, not fast but not slow either. Just steady, like he had all the time in the world. My instincts kicked in. I stood up quickly, dropping the hammer, and my mind raced with possible solutions. Should I run? Should I confront him? But something held me back. Something in the way he moved or didn't move kept me rooted in place. I finally called out again, my voice sharper this time. "Hey, what do you want?" But again, no response. The man just kept walking, his gaze never leaving mine. As he got closer, I noticed more details about him. His jacket was a dull brown, worn with age. His glasses, small and round, reflected the sunlight in an unsettling way. His face was thin, pale, like someone who spent too much time indoors. His hair was light brown, cut short, and his expression was unreadable. He wasn't smiling, frowning, or anything in between. He looked neutral, detached, almost like he didn't care at all. He was close now, too close, and my pulse quickened as he came to a stop just a few feet away from me. The air felt heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on me. He didn't speak. He didn't do anything at all. He just stood there, staring. I could feel the weight of his gaze, cold and intense. I wanted to back away, but my feet felt frozen, like I couldn't move. It was then that I noticed something, the strange smell in the air. It wasn't overpowering, but it was there, lingering. Something chemical almost. My stomach churned, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. What was that? Why did he smell like that? My heart pounded as I stared at him, trying to figure out what was going on. And then, as if on cue, he turned and walked back toward the woods. No hurry, no glance back. He simply turned and walked away. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching him disappear into the trees, my mind spinning with questions. What the hell had just happened? Was I imagining things? Was he some kind of hunter? A hermit living out in the woods? None of it made sense. But as I turned back toward the cabin, I noticed something in the dirt, just where he had been standing. Faint, dark stain. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a patch of wet soil, smeared with something. I didn't want to get any closer. The smell, the way he had just appeared and then left, it all felt wrong. I spent the rest of the day in a daze. I didn't fix the door anymore. Instead, I went inside, locked the door, and sat in the corner, staring at the walls. My mind raced with questions and my body was on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That man, he wasn't just some passerby. I could feel it in my gut. The night came, and with it, a heavy silence, the kind that felt suffocating. But I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his glasses reflecting the light. Felt like he was still out there, watching. The next morning, I packed up. I didn't care about finishing the door or the cabin anymore. The thought of being out there, alone, after what had happened, didn't sit right with me. I didn't even stop to look at the stain on the ground where he'd been. I just wanted to leave. I drove away, leaving the cabin behind, but as I pulled onto the main road, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A figure, standing by the side of the road, watching me drive away. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I still don't know who he was. I never went back to that cabin either. Something about it wasn't right. There's a feeling in my gut, a nagging thought that I'll never shake. I don't know what he wanted or why he was there, but I do know one thing. I'll never forget the man with short glasses. It was the kind of night that makes you question why you ever decided to leave home. The wind howled through the trees, sending cold gusts of air that made the cabin walls creak and groan as though they too were trying to escape the storm. I was alone, completely alone, except for my thoughts and the relentless roar of the storm outside. The rain, thick and heavy, splattered against the windows like rocks, and thunder cracked above, shaking the ground beneath my feet. I'd seen storms like this before, but tonight felt different. I could sense something hanging in the air, something that felt off, like the calm before the storm, a storm that had already arrived. The cabin itself wasn't anything special. It was an old, creaky place, built in the 80s and barely updated since. There were no modern conveniences, just the essentials. A stove, a fireplace, a couple of wooden chairs, and a bed tucked in the back corner of the room. The walls were lined with worn wooden planks, and the floor had that familiar, almost nostalgic scent of pine. It was a small place, secluded deep in the woods, far away from any civilization. Just the way I liked it when I wanted to get away. But tonight, I wasn't here for solitude. I had come to this cabin with one purpose in mind: to confront Chris, my cousin, who had been a cop for as long as I could remember. I had no idea why he insisted on meeting here of all places. It didn't make sense, not when I knew how much he hated being away from the city. But when he called and asked me to meet him here, I couldn't refuse. He had sounded different on the phone, tense, even a little paranoid. I had brushed it off as nothing, assuming he was just tired from his work. But now that I was here, alone in the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The storm had started right after I arrived. The heavy rain came down in sheets, and by the time I had made my way inside, drenched from head to toe, I noticed that the cabin was eerily silent. Too silent. No sign of Chris. I checked my watch. 9:15 p.m. He was supposed to be here by now. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I had this gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. I tried calling him, but there was no answer. Then I heard it, a faint, muffled sound, like something being dragged across the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I stood frozen, listening, my breath caught in my throat. The sound came again, closer this time. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was undeniable. Someone was here. I grabbed the nearest object, one of the heavy metal chairs, and held it tight in my hands, prepared to defend myself if I needed to. The storm outside raged louder as the wind whipped through the trees, but I was focused entirely on the sound. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the small room where the bed was. I couldn't see anything in the dim light. The only illumination came from a flickering lamp on the table, casting long shadows across the walls. I edged closer, every muscle in my body tense, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My fingers tightened around the chair, and I took a deep breath, preparing myself for whatever lay ahead. The sound grew louder, a dragging, scraping noise that now seemed to be coming from just beyond the doorway to the back room. I was almost there when I saw it. A shadow moving across the floor, shifting slowly in the low light. Then, everything happened in a blur. A figure appeared in the doorway. It was Chris, or at least it looked like him. His usual broad shoulders and strong build were unmistakable. But his face, something was off. His eyes were wide, wild, and his breathing was shallow, erratic. He was holding something in his hand, something that gleamed in the light. My eyes locked on it. He was holding a gun. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to scream, to ask him what the hell was going on, but the words caught in my throat. All I could do was stand there, frozen, watching him. "Chris?" I whispered, barely able to get the word out. "What are you doing?" He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped into the room, his eyes darting around nervously, as though he was trying to make sense of everything. His hand trembled as he held the gun, the barrel pointing slightly downward, but it still made me feel like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, one wrong move away from falling off. I backed up slowly, my mind racing, trying to piece together what was happening. I could see it now, the blood on his clothes, the streaks of red that had soaked through his shirt. It was smeared across his hands, his face, as though he had been in the middle of something horrific. "Chris, what happened?" I said, my voice louder this time, more insistent. "What did you do?" His eyes flicked toward me, and for a moment, I saw something in his gaze, something empty. It was like he wasn't really there. He blinked a few times, as though trying to focus, but he didn't say anything. Then, without warning, he dropped the gun to the floor with a loud clatter. I froze again. Something was very, very wrong. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy. The smell of blood was overpowering now, mixed with the mustiness of the old wood and the storm outside. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him, even as my mind screamed for me to run. He finally spoke, his voice low and strained, almost as if he were speaking through a haze. "I had no choice," he muttered. "I had no choice." The words didn't make sense. My cousin, a cop, was standing in front of me, covered in blood, with a gun in his hand, muttering about not having a choice. I tried to make sense of it, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt my stomach churn. I glanced around the cabin, searching for anything that might explain what had happened. The back room. I had to check the back room. I moved slowly, carefully, trying not to make any sudden moves that might set him off. I didn't know what had happened here, but I knew it wasn't good. I reached the door to the back room and pushed it open slowly. I gasped. On the floor, in a pool of blood, lay the body of a man I didn't recognize. His face was pale, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. He was dressed in plain clothes, but his chest was torn open, and the blood had stained the floor beneath him. His arms were twisted in an unnatural position, and I could see the faintest hint of a struggle in the way his body was contorted. I turned back to Chris, who was now standing in the doorway, his expression blank. There was no remorse in his eyes, no recognition of the horror he had caused. It was as though he had become a shell of the person I once knew. "What happened, Chris?" I asked again, my voice trembling. "Who is he?" Chris didn't answer. He simply stepped forward and collapsed to his knees, his head falling into his hands. His body shook, as if the weight of what he had done was finally sinking in. The realization hit me hard. This wasn't some mistake, some misunderstanding. Chris had killed this man, and now he was lost, broken in a way I couldn't understand. I stood there for a long time watching him. The storm raged outside, but inside, there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that weighs heavy on you, crushing you with its quiet intensity. My heart ached for my cousin, for the man he had become, but I knew what had to be done. Couldn't help him. I couldn't save him from what he had done. The reality of the situation was too overwhelming. I had to get out of there before it was too late. I left the cabin that night, in a daze, the rain still pouring down in torrents. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. I couldn't even process what had just happened. It was too much. But one thing was clear. My cousin, the cop, the man I once knew, was gone. And the man who had killed that stranger in the cabin was all that was left. The cabin was far behind me now, lost in the storm. But the memories, the images of that night, would stay with me forever. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. Just me, a cabin in the woods, and a chance to escape the noise of the world. I'd been working long hours at a job that had drained me for months, and I needed time to reset. A break, away from everything. The cabin was isolated, just the way I wanted it. No neighbors for miles. The kind of place where the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of an animal in the brush. I rented the place for the weekend. The cabin was old, built in the 1970s, and it had that rustic charm that felt like something out of an old photograph. The owner, a gruff man in his late 60s, met me at the entrance. He warned me about the wildlife and that the area was pretty remote. He also mentioned, almost casually, that it wasn't uncommon for people to feel uneasy out there, especially at night. "It's the isolation, I guess," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "Takes some getting used to." He handed me the key and left. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just wanted to get in, unpack, and enjoy the solitude. I was in my early 30s, used to city life, but I loved the idea of being alone in nature for a change. The drive up had been long, but once I got to the cabin, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. There was something about the silence out here, broken only by the occasional bird call or the rustling of leaves. It was perfect. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. The wood paneling on the walls and the antique furniture gave it an old-timey feel. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, and the air smelled faintly of cedar and pine. The windows overlooked dense trees and a small clearing. I didn't expect to see anyone for the whole weekend, and I was fine with that. I could hear the wind picking up outside, and I started a fire in the stove to stay warm. It had been a long drive, and I was ready to relax. I spent the first couple of hours exploring the cabin, settling in. I found some old board games and books left behind by previous visitors. One book caught my eye, a journal, its pages worn and yellowed with age. It belonged to someone named Sam, and the last entry was dated about 5 years ago. The words were written in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl, but the meaning was clear. Something had happened here. Sam had written about strange noises in the woods at night, a feeling of being watched, and how unsettling it was to be so far from the nearest town. I put the journal down and tried to shake off the unease that crept into my mind. It was probably just the ramblings of someone who was a little too isolated, too far removed from society. Still, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of discomfort as the wind howled outside. By dusk, the sky had turned a bruised purple, and the wind picked up again, louder this time. I could hear the creaking of the old cabin, the sound of branches scratching against the windows. I tried to focus on the crackling fire, but I kept hearing strange noises coming from outside. Something out of place, a soft shuffle of feet, like someone was walking just beyond the tree line. I chalked it up to my imagination. It had to be. There was no one out there, but as the night deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to head to bed early. The bed was comfortable enough, though the air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. I pulled the blankets around myself and closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound from outside seemed amplified: the wind, the rustling leaves, the creaks of the old structure. But it wasn't just the wind. There was something else. A soft thud, like something or someone was moving around the cabin. I couldn't stand it anymore. I got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight, shining it through the small windows, but all I saw were trees and shadows. I convinced myself it was just a deer or some other animal, but the feeling of being watched, of being not quite alone, refused to leave me. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard the noise again. A loud bang, followed by a scraping sound. It was coming from the back of the cabin, where the woods were densest. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It was close, too close. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to face whatever was out there. But the thought of hiding in the cabin, waiting for someone or something to break in was worse. I grabbed my phone and tried to call the owner, but the signal was weak. There was no way to reach anyone for help. I was alone, completely alone. I debated whether to try to start the truck and drive out, but I knew the road would be nearly impossible to navigate in the dark, especially with how the weather was turning. So I stayed put, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself it was just a raccoon or a bear. Then came a knock. 3 short, rapid knocks on the front door. I froze again, my pulse racing. I hadn't heard a car drive up. There was no reason anyone should be here. The knocking continued. It was deliberate. Someone was out there. I didn't want to answer. I thought about hiding, but then I heard a voice, soft and muffled, just beyond the door. It wasn't clear enough to make out the words, but it was there. And I swear I felt the temperature in the cabin drop. I waited, hoping whoever it was would leave, but the knocking didn't stop. I gripped the flashlight harder, almost to the point of breaking it, and cautiously approached the door. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see anyone through the small peephole. The dark outside was absolute. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash from the back of the cabin again. I spun around. The sound of heavy footsteps followed. Someone was moving quickly. Whoever it was coming in. I backed away from the door, the flashlight shaking in my hands. My mind raced. I had to make a decision. I could try to escape, but that might make me an easier target. Or I could confront whatever was out there, armed with only a flashlight. I chose the latter. I grabbed a large kitchen knife from the counter and moved toward the back of the cabin, where the noise had come from. The wind was howling louder now, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something wrong about the way the trees bent and swayed in the storm. Felt unnatural. I moved cautiously, trying not to make a sound. As I approached the back window, I caught a glimpse of movement, shadows shifting between the trees. There was someone there watching me. Panic surged through me, but I fought it down. I had to act. I darted out the back door, hoping to catch whoever was there by surprise. The night air slapped against my face, cold and biting. My breath came out in shaky clouds. I crept forward, trying to stay low, but the crunch of dead leaves underfoot betrayed me. The figure turned quickly, and I saw him clearly for the first time. A man, tall and gaunt, dressed in dark, tattered clothes. His face was obscured by a hood, but his eyes, wide, unblinking, glared at me with an intensity that made my stomach turn. I didn't wait for him to make a move. I lunged at him, swinging the knife with all my strength. The man reacted quickly, dodging the blow and knocking me to the ground. I scrambled to get back up, but he was faster. His hands were like iron, grabbing me by the throat, squeezing harder than I could have imagined. I kicked and struggled, but his grip was unyielding. I thought this was it, this was the end. Then, just as quickly as it had started, he let go. I gasped for air, the world spinning around me. The man took a few steps back, still watching me with those cold, dead eyes. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't wait around to find out what he wanted. I ran back to the cabin as fast as I could, locked every door, and didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. By morning, I was exhausted and shaken. I didn't bother trying to leave. There was no way I was stepping foot outside again. I just waited until the sun had fully risen, then packed my things and drove out of there. I never found out who the man was or what he wanted, but I didn't care. I would never go near that cabin again. Some places are meant to be left alone. Some things are better off staying in the dark, where they belong. It was late in the fall, and I had driven several hours into the backcountry to a cabin my cousin, Andy, had left me after he passed. He'd been a reclusive guy, a woodsman who spent most of his time alone in the forest, cutting wood, hunting, and doing whatever it was he did when he wasn't working in town. After he died, I didn't know what to do with the place. I wasn't exactly a fan of the wilderness myself, but the cabin had been left to me, so I thought I'd give it a try. Besides, I needed a break from the city, from everything. I arrived late that evening, just as the last hints of daylight were fading from the sky. The forest surrounding the cabin was dense, a tangle of trees and undergrowth that seemed to close in as I drove the final mile. The gravel road was narrow and twisted, a far cry from any highway I was used to. There was a chill in the air, the kind that makes you want to pull your coat tighter around you, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled my nose. The trees here were thick, older, and gnarled, their branches intertwining above me like twisted fingers. The cabin itself was small, tucked away near a small stream that ran through the property. It was a simple building, wooden logs stacked up to form the walls, a chimney on the roof, and a porch that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The windows were dark, covered in grime, and the door looked like it had been left ajar for far too long. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and walked up to the porch. The door creaked open, protesting against the cold air. Inside, everything was just as I remembered it from the last time I visited. Furniture that looked like it had been left in place for decades, dust settling over everything like a heavy blanket. There was a faint smell of mildew, but it wasn't unbearable. I spent the first few hours getting the place in some semblance of order, sweeping the floor, wiping down counters, trying to make the cabin a little more livable. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me feel like I was settling in. After a long drive, all I wanted was some rest. I cracked open a can of soup, ate, and sat in front of the fireplace for a while, staring into the fire as it crackled and popped. The first night, there were no sounds except the wind rattling the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was eerie in a quiet way, but nothing to worry about. I lay down on the old, creaky bed in the back room and drifted off to sleep, the smell of wood smoke and pine filling my senses. I woke up in the middle of the night. At first, I couldn't place the noise. It wasn't a loud bang or crash, but something subtle, a scratching sound, like something dragging across the floor. My heart rate picked up. I lay still for a moment, straining my ears, trying to decipher the sound. It was coming from the hallway outside my room. I told myself it was just the wind. Maybe a branch had fallen on the roof. But then the sound came again. Slow, deliberate, scraping against the wooden floorboards. It wasn't the wind. I got up, grabbing the flashlight I'd set beside the bed. The beam of light flickered for a moment before it steadied, cutting through the darkness in the small hallway. The air felt colder now, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I stood still, listening. There was no sound now, just the hum of silence pressing against my ears. I moved toward the living room, my feet making almost no noise on the old wooden floors. The flashlight swept over the furniture, nothing out of place. I checked the windows, locked. The front door was still closed. There was no sign of anything unusual, but that nagging feeling in my gut told me something was off. I decided to check outside. Maybe a wild animal had gotten too close to the cabin, though I didn't know what kind of animal would be out here this late. I grabbed my jacket and stepped onto the porch. The night was cold, the sky clear with stars that seemed too bright for this time of year. There was a slight breeze, but nothing too significant. I scanned the area around the cabin, the flashlight beam cutting through the night. Nothing, just the trees, just the shadows of the forest. I took a deep breath, convinced that I had imagined the sound, or maybe it was some small animal that had caused the noise inside. I turned to go back into the cabin, but as I did, something caught my eye in the distance, something large moving between the trees. The figure was too tall, too human in shape to be an animal, but it wasn't quite right. It was like a shadow, a blur of movement, not fully solid, but not translucent either. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It was still too far for me to make out any details, but I could feel it watching me, whatever it was. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation getting to me. But that feeling of being watched didn't go away. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the figure disappeared into the trees. I waited for a long time, not knowing what to do, but nothing else happened. No more sounds, no more figures. I eventually went back inside, locked the door, and sat by the fire, trying to convince myself it had been nothing. The next day, I decided to do some work around the cabin. The area around it was overgrown, and I could see that the small stream behind the cabin had flooded recently, washing out a section of the path. I figured it was as good a time as any to check things out and make sure everything was intact. I spent the better part of the day clearing away the brush, chopping some wood, and making sure the place was secure. The weather was turning, clouds rolling in overhead, and the wind picked up as the afternoon wore on. I had just finished stacking a pile of firewood when I heard something again. This time, a soft noise, like something brushing against the cabin's wall. I immediately turned, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. There was no one in sight, but the feeling returned, that same sense of being watched. I scanned the trees around the cabin, but there was nothing. No movement, no shape. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. It felt wrong, like the forest had suddenly become an enemy. I went inside, locked the door again, and tried to ignore the gnawing sense of unease creeping over me. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every sound, the wind against the walls, the creak of the cabin's old beams, made me jump. I lay awake for hours, waiting for anything to happen. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. This time, it was a loud thud against the door. I jumped out of bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight, my hands trembling, and went to the door. The beam of light shone through the cracks, but there was nothing outside. No sound, no movement. I unlocked the door, opened it just a crack, and scanned the yard. It was dark. So dark that the flashlight barely illuminated anything more than a few feet in front of me. I stepped outside, the cool air biting at my skin, and looked around. There was nothing, no figure, no sign of anything unusual. I stood there for a long moment, feeling like a fool for even thinking something was out there. But just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something, a footprint in the mud near the edge of the porch. It was large, deep, and unmistakably human, but the shape of the toes was wrong. The foot was too wide, the arch too low. It didn't belong to anyone I knew. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my mind racing. Whoever or whatever had been out there was still close by. The next morning, I packed up my things and left the cabin, my heart still racing from the events of the past few nights. I wasn't sure if it had been some person playing tricks on me or something else entirely, but whatever it was, it had been too close to the truth for comfort. I never went back to that cabin. That was the last time I ever went into those woods. The forest remains as wild as ever, untouched by time. I heard later that someone else bought the property, but I never saw them. It was better that way. Some places, some moments are meant to stay buried in the past. And for me, that cabin and everything around it will remain lost in the shadows, where it belongs. It had been one of those long, grueling weeks, and the thought of a quiet weekend away from the noise and stress of city life seemed like the perfect escape. So, when I found the old cabin on the edge of the woods, tucked away in a remote part of the countryside, I thought I'd struck gold. A break in nature, far from the distractions of everyday life, was exactly what I needed. The cabin was located in a secluded corner of the Yorkshire Dales, in a tiny village called Langdale, a place that seemed to belong to another era. The land was surrounded by thick, dense forests, rolling hills, and the occasional meadow dotted with wildflowers. It was everything you'd imagine when you think of a traditional English countryside. Peaceful, isolated, and beautifully serene. I arrived on Friday afternoon, my car winding down the narrow, uneven roads that led to the cabin. The skies were overcast, and a slight drizzle had begun to fall, just enough to make the leaves glisten with moisture. It was the kind of weather that set the mood for a solitary retreat. My phone barely had a signal, but I didn't mind. The absence of connection felt almost comforting. It was just me, the cabin, and the quiet of the countryside. The cabin itself was older than I had expected. It was a simple stone structure with a sagging roof, a small porch, and a single window that looked out over the forest. The wood surrounding it was a faded brown, with the kind of rustic charm you'd see in a country postcard. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the scent of aged wood and earth filled the air. I stepped inside, setting my bags down in the small living area. There was a stone fireplace, a few old chairs, and a simple wooden table in the center of the room. The windows were small, and the place felt cozy but a little too empty. I took a moment to admire the silence. As I unpacked, I thought about how peaceful it would be to spend a couple of days here, just me and the landscape. I figured I'd spend the evening sitting by the fire, reading a book, and listening to the sound of the rain outside. But there was something unsettling about the cabin, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was more than the solitude or the quiet. It was as if the air around the cabin was a little too still, a little too thick with anticipation. Maybe it was just me, overthinking things. That evening, I lit the fire in the hearth, and the flickering light cast long shadows on the wooden walls. The sound of the rain pattering against the roof only heightened the sense of isolation. After a light dinner, I settled into the armchair near the fire with my book. Time seemed to slow down, and I couldn't help but feel like I was in a different world, one that had little connection to anything outside this small cabin. As the hours passed, the rain grew heavier. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. I couldn't see much outside through the small windows, but the sound of branches creaking in the wind made my skin crawl. I wasn't afraid, exactly, but there was an undercurrent of unease that had been building all evening. It was around midnight when the noises started. I had just finished reading a chapter of my book when I heard a distinct creak from upstairs. It was soft at first, barely audible over the sound of the storm outside. I dismissed it, attributing it to the old building settling. But then it came again, this time louder, like someone walking across the floorboards above. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The cabin was small, and there was no one else there, just me. I walked over to the stairs that led up to the second floor. The creaking continued, but it didn't sound like something settling anymore. It sounded like footsteps. I hesitated at the base of the stairs, trying to gather my thoughts. Maybe it was an animal, though I couldn't see how that could be. There were no signs of anything outside the cabin when I arrived. The thought of an intruder didn't cross my mind right away, but the idea started to grow in my head as I stood in the dark, listening to the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. I'd lived in older houses, and I knew that settling could make strange sounds. But this wasn't that. This was something else. With every second that passed, the noise grew louder and more distinct, until it was impossible to ignore. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I stayed frozen in place. The wind howled outside, and the rain beat relentlessly on the roof, masking any other sounds that might have been happening nearby. I slowly made my way to the bottom of the stairs, my heart racing. The creaking had stopped for a moment, but I could feel it in the pit of my stomach that something was wrong. I knew I should go upstairs, check things out, but the air felt heavy, suffocating. I took a deep breath and slowly started up the stairs. The boards creaked under my feet as I ascended, each step seeming to take forever. When I reached the top, the noise stopped entirely. The stillness that greeted me was almost worse than the sounds of the footsteps. There was nothing in the hallway, no one standing there, no sign of anyone having been there at all. I checked each room, small, with nothing more than a few pieces of furniture, dusty old furniture, and found nothing unusual. No one was there. The house was empty. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. I hadn't been sleeping well in the city, and the isolation of the cabin was probably getting to me. I walked back downstairs, but the uneasy feeling remained. I spent the rest of the night on edge, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of the leaves outside, made my skin crawl. But as the morning light broke through the curtains, I convinced myself it had just been my imagination. It was a quiet place, and the weather had been strange. That was all. The next day, I spent some time walking around the property. There was a small stream nearby, and I wandered down the muddy path to it, taking in the sights and sounds of the countryside. The air felt fresh, and for a while, I forgot about the previous night's unsettling events. But when I returned to the cabin that evening, something was off. It was more than the usual quiet. The atmosphere felt thick, oppressive. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The noises started again that night, but this time they weren't coming from upstairs. They were coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, branches tapping against the windows or the sound of the rain hitting the roof. But when I stepped closer to the window, I saw something. A figure, standing just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the dim light. It was the shape of a man, but he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the cabin. I froze, unsure if I was seeing things. My heart began to race as I stepped back from the window, trying to process what I was seeing. The figure didn't seem to notice me, but he stood there for what felt like hours, unmoving. His features were obscured by the darkness, but I could feel the weight of his gaze even from a distance. I don't know how long I stood there, watching him, but when I finally turned away, my whole body was shaking. I grabbed my bag, ready to leave the cabin behind and drive back to the village. I didn't care about the weather or the distance. I had to get out of there. As I turned to grab my coat, the sound of the footsteps returned. This time, much closer. They were coming from inside the cabin. The feeling of being trapped, of being watched from both inside and outside, overwhelmed me. I bolted out of the cabin, running as fast as I could toward the car. As I drove away, The cabin grew smaller in my rearview mirror, but the sense of unease stayed with me for the entire journey. The next day, I found out from the locals that the cabin had a history. It had once belonged to a hermit, someone who had lived there alone for years. But there were whispers about strange happenings, about people who'd come to stay there and never returned. I don't know how much of it was true, but I never went back. The cabin is still there, I hear. The locals avoid it, and sometimes, when the wind is right, you can hear the creaking of the floorboards, just like the footsteps I heard that night. But I've learned to never return to that place, not after what happened. I've never been able to shake the feeling that something was watching me, something that still lingers in that old cabin, waiting for someone else to come. It was late October when I decided to take a solo trip to the cabin that I'd inherited from my grandfather. The place sat on a small piece of land in the middle of nowhere, nestled between a thick forest and an old, forgotten cemetery. I had heard stories about the cabin from my dad when I was younger, but most of it felt like just folklore to me until I saw the place for myself. The cabin itself was built with rough-hewn logs, darkened with age and weather. It was solid, though sturdy enough to withstand whatever the elements might throw at it. The roof was steep, coated in moss and leaves, and the small porch creaked underfoot as I approached with my bag slung over my shoulder. My grandfather had kept it up well, but after he passed away, it had been left empty for years. The idea of staying in a place that old, surrounded by the dense forest and the cemetery that bordered the property, was unsettling, but I wanted to clear my head. Life had gotten complicated recently, and I needed to get away from everything. The drive out was long. I hadn't been to the cabin in nearly 10 years, and the roads leading up to it seemed to fade more and more as I went. The last stretch of road was unpaved, thick with mud from a recent rainstorm. The trees had already begun to shed their leaves, turning the woods into a patchwork of yellow and brown. It felt like something straight out of an old horror movie, but I brushed off the feeling. When I finally arrived, the first thing that struck me was the silence. Not the peaceful kind you might expect in a place like this, but a heavy, unnerving silence that pressed in from all sides. There was no hum of distant traffic, no sound of animals in the woods, nothing but the wind rustling through the branches and the faint, distant sound of an old bell ringing from the cemetery. I chalked it up to my nerves, telling myself I'd be fine. I unpacked quickly, settling into the cabin. The inside was just as I remembered: old furniture, a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with old volumes that smelled faintly of mildew. My grandfather had never been one to throw anything away, so the place had an almost hoarder-like feel to it, though it wasn't overwhelming. It was just cluttered, like stepping into another era. That night, I made a fire in the fireplace and settled in with a book, hoping to distract myself from the strange feeling that had taken hold of me. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees and making the old cabin creak in protest. Every now and then, I'd hear a faint thud on the roof, like something was moving up there, but I figured it was just leaves falling. I didn't sleep much that night. The wind kept me awake, and the eerie quiet of the cemetery just beyond the trees felt too close. Around 3 a.m., I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. My heart jumped into my throat. I was alone, and the thought of someone else being out there in the woods in the dead of night made me freeze. The footsteps circled the cabin for a while, then stopped. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. The sound of the wind had drowned out most other noises, but I swore I heard someone breathing softly just outside the door. Then it stopped. I lay there, stiff with fear, until the sun finally started to break through the trees. When I ventured outside to investigate, I found nothing. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there at all. I thought maybe I had imagined it, a trick of the wind or the dark. The second day passed without incident, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stayed close to the cabin, not wanting to go too far into the woods, and kept my eyes on the cemetery. Something about the place unsettled me, even more so as I stood there looking at the gravestones, most of them weathered and covered in vines. Some dates on the stones were so old, I could barely read them, but others were more recent. The thought of people still being buried there, it seemed wrong somehow. As dusk fell that night, I was in the kitchen preparing a simple meal when I heard the footsteps again, slow and methodical, as if someone was pacing around the cabin. My stomach twisted, and a cold sweat broke out on my back. This time, I wasn't imagining it. There was someone out there. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door, shining the light in all directions. Nothing. No one was in sight. I stepped outside, my feet crunching on the gravel, and circled the cabin. The wind howled through the trees, and the cemetery beyond was just a dark silhouette against the sky. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. That night, I bolted all the doors and windows. Not that it would have mattered much if someone wanted to get in. I kept the light on in the kitchen, and I stayed up reading, trying to keep my mind off the odd happenings. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Every creak of the cabin seemed amplified. Every rustle outside sent my heart racing. Around 2 a.m., the footsteps returned, louder this time. They were on the porch, pacing back and forth, and then a soft knock at the door. I didn't move, couldn't. My mind was racing, wondering if I should call someone. But who? There was no signal out here, no neighbors for miles. I was completely alone. The knock came again, louder this time, almost demanding. My pulse pounded in my ears as I pressed myself against the wall, listening. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. I waited, but nothing more happened. I don't know when I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, but the next morning, I was still shaken. I spent most of the next day inside, trying to keep myself occupied, though I couldn't stop glancing out the windows toward the cemetery. By now, I was certain I wasn't imagining things. Someone was out there, watching me, or maybe worse, trying to get in. I knew the logical part of me should just leave, pack up, and head back home. But the idea of leaving that place alone, in the dark, was even worse. I had to stay. That night, I locked every door, bolted every window, and set up a chair next to the fireplace. I didn't care about the fire anymore. I just wanted to hear anything that might be coming toward me. At about midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they weren't just on the porch. They were out in the yard, circling the cabin. I heard a rustling in the leaves, the sound of something moving through the trees. I could feel my heart pounding, my hands shaking as I gripped the chair. The wind had died down, and all I could hear now were the footsteps. Slow, methodical, like whoever was out there knew exactly what they were doing. I could barely bring myself to look out the window, but I did. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but shadows. But then I saw something move, just a flicker in the trees, something tall and thin, barely visible. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I waited for what seemed like hours, but nothing more happened. No more sounds, no more movement. I finally allowed myself to breathe again, but something in me told me this wasn't over. I wasn't alone out here. I had to figure out who or what was haunting me. The next morning, I packed up and left, not even bothering to check the graveyard or the cabin for anything. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew I didn't want to stay another night in that place. The drive back was long and quiet, but as I passed through the woods on my way out, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me from the shadows. It's been weeks now since I left, and I haven't returned. I don't know if I ever will. The cabin is still there, sitting quietly on the edge of the cemetery, waiting for the next person brave or foolish enough to spend a night in the woods. But me, I'm done with that place. Some things are better left untouched. I never expected a simple weekend getaway to turn into something like this. It was supposed to be a break, just a few days away from the noise and constant bustle of life. I wanted to clear my head, find some peace, maybe even reconnect with nature. The cabin, secluded deep in the woods, had been my father's place once. He always talked about how serene it was out there, how nothing but the trees and wind would keep you company. I figured that if I stayed there long enough, the world outside would fade, and I'd finally find some quiet. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly the isolation would turn into something far worse. The drive up was long, but it was nothing compared to the days I had spent working. The cabin was tucked away on the edge of a small, forgotten logging trail. I had never been there before, but my dad had given me directions years ago. Right after he passed, actually. He said it was the perfect place to get away from everything, but I'd never taken the time to visit. Now it was just me, alone. I arrived in the late afternoon. The woods looked thick around me, dark even under the dimming sun. The cabin itself was just as I imagined it would be. Old, weathered wood with moss creeping up the sides. The windows were fogged with age, and the porch was littered with broken branches and leaves. It had that smell of dust and pine, a scent I hadn't even realized I'd missed. I parked my truck, grabbed my gear, and set off up the small path leading to the front door. Inside, the cabin was basic, but it had everything I needed. A small kitchen with an old stove, a wood-burning fireplace in the center of the room, a sturdy table, and a couple of chairs. The bed was tucked in the corner, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with books and old photos. It wasn't fancy by any means, but it felt like a place where someone had lived quietly, with no need for attention. For some reason, that appealed to me. The world felt far away when I was inside that cabin. The sun set quickly, and as I made a fire in the hearth, I felt the temperature drop sharply. The air was heavy with the scent of wood smoke and pine. Outside, the wind began to pick up, howling through the trees like a distant cry. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just the wind, after all. Still, something about the way the trees swayed in the gusts felt different, like the forest itself was moving. I spent the evening reading, making a simple dinner, and enjoying the peace. But as the night wore on, I noticed something odd. There was a sound outside. It wasn't the usual rustling of the wind or the occasional call of a bird. It was heavier, like something was walking through the woods, large and deliberate. I tried to dismiss it at first, but the sound kept coming. Crunch, crunch, the unmistakable sound of heavy steps on dry leaves. I sat still for a moment, my heart rate picking up. My instincts told me it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but it was too calculated, too methodical for an animal. The sound circled the cabin, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't have a gun with me, and while the cabin had an old axe leaning against the wall, I wasn't sure that would help much against whatever was outside. Then it stopped, dead silent. I strained to listen, but all I could hear was the wind. I got up and moved to the window, peering through the fog glass. It was too dark to see anything beyond the trees, but I thought I caught a glimpse of something moving at the edge of the forest. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a person, someone else staying out here. But who would be out in this wilderness at this hour? And why would they be sneaking around the cabin? I tried to shake it off, but my gut told me to be cautious. I turned off the lights, grabbed the flashlight from my bag, and crept towards the door. My hand shook as I gripped the handle. I wasn't sure if I was about to confront someone or if I was just imagining things, but I wasn't going to sit in that cabin with an unknown presence outside. When I stepped outside, The cold hit me like a slap to the face. I turned on the flashlight and scanned the area. Nothing. The trees were still, and the night air was thick with an unnatural quiet. I moved cautiously around the cabin, looking for any sign of movement. For a few moments, I felt like I might be overreacting, but that thought quickly vanished when I heard the sound again. It wasn't coming from the woods now. It was coming from behind the cabin, closer than before. The footsteps, those deliberate, calculated steps, sounded almost like they were circling me, moving in a pattern that felt wrong. I froze. I had no idea what I was dealing with. Fear gripped me, but curiosity pushed me to move closer. I rounded the corner of the cabin and froze again. There, in the shadow of the trees, I saw something moving. It was large, crouched low to the ground, like it was waiting, watching. It wasn't human, at least not in any way I could understand. Its body was twisted, contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It had the shape of a man but was hunched over unnaturally. The silhouette was dark, its limbs long and jointed in the wrong places. And its eyes reflected the light from my flashlight, glowing faintly red in the dark. I wanted to scream, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I stood there, transfixed by whatever this thing was, as it stared back at me with an unsettling calm. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it darted into the woods, disappearing into the thick darkness of the forest. My legs gave out, and I stumbled back against the cabin, breathing heavily. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it a bear? No bear could move like that. Could it? The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I wasn't sure if it was the creature or the woods themselves, but it was as if every tree, every shadow was alive. I locked the door and grabbed the axe. I knew I wasn't going to get any sleep tonight, but that didn't matter. I just needed to survive until morning. Hours passed. I couldn't bring myself to look outside again. I stayed by the fire, too afraid to close my eyes, too terrified to let the darkness swallow me. The wind outside began to howl louder, shaking the cabin like a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing footsteps in the distance, but they never came close enough for me to do anything about it. I had no idea how long I sat there, but the night stretched on, endless and torturous. Just as the first light of dawn began to break, the sounds stopped. The woods fell silent, and I slowly allowed myself to breathe again. The creature, or whatever it was gone. It was as if the night had just been a bad dream, and I was finally waking up. I waited until I could no longer hear the wind or the footsteps, then ventured outside. The forest looked the same, still and untouched. I walked around the cabin cautiously, checking the ground for signs of anything unusual. But there was nothing.
No footprints.
No broken branches. It was as if the thing I had seen had never existed. I decided to leave. I didn't feel safe anymore. The peace I had come looking for had been shattered, replaced by something that I couldn't explain. I packed my things quickly, locked up the cabin, and drove away, leaving the woods behind. I didn't look back. To this day, I'm not sure what I saw that night. Was it a person? Some kind of animal? Or something far worse? Something ancient and twisted that belongs to the woods and not to the world of men? I don't know, but I never went back to that cabin. And I never will. And as for the woods, I haven't set foot in them since. It was the middle of October when I arrived at the cabin. The small cottage sat at the edge of a dense forest in the northern part of the United Kingdom. I'd always wanted to escape the noise of the city, to be alone with my thoughts, and to experience a kind of solitude that seemed impossible in my everyday life. It was supposed to be a retreat, a few days of peace and quiet away from work and the distractions of technology. I'd rented the cabin from an elderly couple who lived about 20 miles away. They had been kind enough to leave a key under the porch, instructions for the stove, and a note welcoming me. When I arrived, the air was crisp, and the faint scent of pine hung in the air. The surrounding forest was thick, with towering trees that stretched as far as the eye could see. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves as the wind moved through the branches. The cabin was old but well-maintained, with wooden beams running across the ceiling and a large stone fireplace. It had that cozy, almost comforting feeling, like stepping into a forgotten time. Inside, there was a comfortable couch, a simple kitchen with a small dining table, and a couple of bedrooms. The bedroom I chose had a large window that overlooked the woods. It was perfect, quiet, peaceful, and exactly what I had needed. I spent the first day exploring the area, taking long walks through the forest and along a nearby creek. The air was fresh, and the scenery was stunning, the autumn leaves turning shades of red and gold. The feeling of being alone in nature was exactly what I had hoped for. There was nothing but the sound of my footsteps and the occasional bird call. No traffic, no people, just me and the forest. By evening, I returned to the cabin, feeling content and a little tired. I started a fire in the hearth, roasted a quick dinner, and curled up with a book. The warmth from the fire was comforting as the temperature outside dropped. I was grateful for the solitude, for the way the flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the walls. But as night fully settled in, something changed. It was subtle at first, a slight unease I couldn't quite place. The house creaked as if the wood was settling, and the wind outside howled, making the trees sway. It was strange, but not frightening, just unsettling. I pushed it aside, thinking I was simply imagining things. I went to bed around midnight, the wind still howling outside. As I lay in the bed, staring at the wooden beams above me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The wind, which had been gentle earlier, now felt more like a presence, more like it was trying to tell me something. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the isolation was getting to me. But then I heard it, a faint tapping sound, almost like a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was a branch hitting the window, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was coming from the front of the cabin. I froze, my heart beginning to race. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was knocking on the door, waiting for an answer. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was the wind playing tricks on me. But the knocking didn't stop, persisted. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Reluctantly, I got out of bed, pulled on my slippers, and walked across the cabin. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I reached for the door, my hand trembling slightly as I gripped the handle. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door. The cold night air hit me instantly, and I stepped outside, squinting into the darkness. The only light came from the dim glow of the cabin, casting long shadows on the ground. I looked around. Nothing. No one. The forest was silent, and the wind had died down to a soft whisper. There was nothing out there. I sighed with relief and stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just an animal or the wind. Maybe a tree had fallen and knocked against the cabin. That was all. But the unsettling feeling lingered. I returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing small sounds, like something scraping along the outside of the cabin. It was as if something or someone was moving around just outside my reach, waiting. But whenever I'd get up to check, there was never anything there. It was always silent, still, empty. On the third day, the weather took a turn for the worse. A steady rain began to fall, and the wind picked up again, howling through the trees. I had planned to go hiking that day, but the storm made it impossible. Instead, I stayed inside, reading and pacing, restless from the cabin's growing claustrophobia. That afternoon, the tapping returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. It came in rhythmic intervals, almost like someone was tapping with their fingers on the window next to my bed. I froze, my heart pounding. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I glanced toward the window. There, in the dim light, I saw her, a woman standing just outside the window. She was motionless, barely visible through the rain-splattered glass. Her face was pale, almost sickly, and her hair was dark, hanging in wet strands around her face. She didn't move, didn't blink. She simply stood there, staring inside. Couldn't breathe. My body went numb, and my mind raced to make sense of what I was seeing. Who was she? Why was she standing outside in the storm? I backed away from the window slowly, not taking my eyes off her. The rain fell harder, but she didn't move. She remained there, as still as a statue, her face expressionless. I felt a chill creep up my spine, an irrational fear taking hold of me. I couldn't explain it, but something about her was wrong. I waited for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. The rain kept falling, the sound of it hammering against the roof and windows. I dared not move, afraid that the moment I looked away, she would disappear. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. I rushed to the window, heart racing, but she was nowhere to be seen. The rain continued to pour, but there was no sign of her. No footprints in the mud, no trace that anyone had been there at all. My mind raced with possibilities. Had it been a trick of the light? A figment of my imagination brought on by too much isolation? But no, the fear that gripped me felt too real. That woman had been there. I was certain of it. I spent the rest of the day inside, never straying far from the windows or the door. The storm raged outside, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the cabin. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and questions, none of which made sense. That night, the tapping returned once more, but this time it was accompanied by a low, guttural sound. A kind of whispering, but not a voice. It was almost like a moan, something inhuman. My blood ran cold as I sat frozen in my bed, listening. I had no intention of going outside again, but the curiosity gnawed at me. Could it have been her again, or someone else? I knew I had to leave the cabin. The storm was still heavy as I grabbed my things, but I couldn't stay there any longer. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I knew I couldn't let myself be trapped in that place any longer. I pulled on my boots, gathered my things, and headed for the door. But as I opened it, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing just at the edge of the porch, was the woman. She was soaked to the bone, her hair clinging to her face, her eyes wide and unblinking. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stared at me. I didn't wait. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I backed away from the door, not knowing what to do next. I had no phone signal, no way to contact anyone. I was alone, stranded, and something was terribly wrong. Then, as quickly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The whispering ceased. The woman disappeared, leaving me in silence. I never stayed in that cabin again. The next morning, when the storm finally passed, I packed up my things and left. I don't know who the woman was, or if she was even real, but I do know one thing for sure. Something was wrong with that place. Something that I couldn't explain. I never returned to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will.